Good morning. This is History for Monday, May the 4th, 2020. We're doing Lesson 70. The United States enters the Vietnam War, the year 1965. You will find that there are many different opinions on the Vietnam War. Americans actually will probably debate for centuries the role of the United States in the Vietnam War. Regardless of the opinions, the war in Vietnam was both a war of independence and a civil war that harmed soldiers and civilians alike. First, the geography. That Vietnam is an S-shaped country located on the eastern rim of the Indochina Peninsula. Vietnam's long, thin coast faces the Gulf of Tonkin and the South China Sea, providing over 2,000 miles of beautiful beaches with inlets, lagoons, and natural rock formations. The tropical interior of Vietnam contains thick jungles, wooded mountains, and farmland, perfectly suited for rice as the main crop of Vietnam. As far as the political history of Vietnam, as far back as 111 BC, Vietnam was overpowered by China, which is its large neighbor to the north. The Chinese maintained control of Vietnam for over 1,000 years. Vietnam became an independent state in 939 AD, but the next 1,000 years were tainted by civil wars and border wars. Civil wars erupted between the ruling families of Vietnam that divided the North from the South. Border wars raged between Vietnam and its neighbor to the southwest, the Khmer Empire of Cambodia. The French occupied Cambodia from 1863 to 1953. In addition to taking control of Cambodia and parts of Laos, the French seized Vietnam piece by piece. By 1883, the French had possession of the entire nation. Following the models of imperialism and colonization from centuries past, the French lorded themselves over the people of Vietnam in much the same way that they lorded themselves over the Cambodians. The French continued to rule over Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, otherwise known as French Indochina, until Japan entered the scene as the superpower of the Pacific. Remember, Japan allied itself with Nazi Germany and expanded its reach to all corners of Southeast Asia. The Japanese took possession of Vietnam in 1940. But Japan was abruptly stripped of its power in 1945 after the two decimating atomic bombs. Japan surrendered its position in the Pacific and released Vietnam from its grasp. Unfortunately, France rushed back in to fill the void. After World War II, the French returned to Vietnam to pick up right where they had left off. The people of Vietnam had a 2,000-year history of Chinese occupation, civil war, border war, French occupation, Japanese occupation, and then the return of French occupation. They had had enough of foreign rule. While some Vietnamese did flourish under the foreign overseers, most did not. 3/4 of the Vietnamese were poor peasant farmers. Held together by strong family ties, generations of farmers worked the watery rice fields of Vietnam with little opportunity to prosper or achieve a higher standard of living. At the close of World War II, as Vietnam was losing its independence to France again, a rather astute Vietnamese man, small and wispy in frame, was rising behind the scenes to try and save his country from foreign rule. His name was Ho Chi Minh. Though Ho Chi Minh was born in Vietnam, he spent 30 years traveling around the world under various names and professions. He was part adventurer, part intellect, and part idealist, dabbling in politics and philosophy as he journeyed about the globe. In one such adventure in 1990, just after World War I, Ho Chi Minh attempted to meet U.S. President Woodrow Wilson at peace talks in Versailles. Ho Chi Minh hoped to persuade President Wilson and the United States to support his campaign to free Vietnam from France. In his appeal, Ho Chi borrowed some familiar words from the U.S. Declaration of Independence. He wrote, "We hold the truth that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." If Wilson had ever heard this plea and responded, history might have been different. But Ho didn't get his time with Wilson. He was ignored at the peace talks and sent away. Ironically, while Ho Chi Minh was in Paris, he was exposed to a creed quite different from the Declaration of Independence. He was introduced to the Communist Manifesto written by Karl Marx. When Ho read Marx, he equated the French and the Japanese with Marx's definition of the Bourgeois. He identified the peasant farmers of Vietnam with Marx's definition of the proletariat. Do you remember what Marx proposed? To end the conflict between the two? Revolution of the proletariat. This all made sense to Ho Chi Minh. A nationalist at heart, he believed that a communist revolution of the working class would free his people from overbearing foreign rule. Ho Chi Minh returned to Vietnam at the age of 51, rallying others to the hope of freedom. He turned again to the words from the U.S. Declaration of Independence to pronounce the self-rule of Vietnam on September 2, 1945. Ho Chi Minh was hailed as a hero by many of his people. He believed, or at least hoped, that the United States would back him in declaring independence from France, but that would never happen. Ho Chi Minh organized his new autonomous government from the city of Hanoi in northern Vietnam. Borrowing communist ideas for revolution, he proceeded to build the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, commonly called the Viet Minh. Enemies of Ho would, in a derogatory manner, call the communist forces the Viet Cong. Bear in mind that not all Vietnamese were on board with Ho Chi Minh. Numerous groups in the South were loyal to France. They were also loyal to a Vietnamese emperor named Bao Di. It may sound confusing that the Vietnamese had an emperor of their own, but the French and the Japanese had allowed Vietnamese emperors to keep their thrones as figureheads of the nation. Bao Dai ruled first under the French, then under the Japanese, and then served under the French again as chief of state. He was very much a puppet ruler without much power. Within a year of Ho Chi Minh's Declaration of Independence, Vietnam was split in half between Ho's forces in the north and French troops in the south. What started as a small-scale rebellion against the French grew into a full-blown conflict called First Indochina War. The war escalated globally when Chinese communists and Soviet communists gave aid and weapons to Ho in the north. The United States gave aid and advisors to the French and Bao Dai in the south. Why did the United States side with the French in South Vietnam? It is complex and controversial, but generally speaking, the United States was more concerned with containing communism than with seeing a small nation earn its independence from a foreign oppressor. This was the era of the Cold War. With the Soviets backing Ho Chi Minh in the north, U.S. leaders felt obliged to do this very opposite and support the South. The First Indochina War was extremely brutal and lasted 8 years from 1946 to 1954. The French viewed it as an extension of the Korean War, believing they had a right to govern Vietnam. Americans saw it as part of the Cold War, believing it was their duty to contain communism. The Viet Minh forces of Ho Chi Minh and in the North clung to the war as a desperate battle for independence. The South Vietnamese were confused. Under the divided leadership of the French, the United States, and Bao Dai, they had no clarity about whom or what they were fighting for or against. Chaos would plague the South for decades. In 1949, the French granted independence to Bao Dai, but this gesture did not satisfy Ho Chi Minh. He continued to fight forces in the South, hoping to unite Vietnam as one communist nation. After a staggering show of strength at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the Viet Minh defeated the French. The two sides agreed to a ceasefire in 1954, and several nations gathered at the Geneva Conference to decide the fate of Vietnam. In the same way that Korea was divided in half to end its civil war, Vietnam was officially divided in half as well. Leaders of the Geneva Conference drew the dividing line at the 17th parallel, which is a line of latitude on the globe. And you can see that in our map here. 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh and his communist Viet Minh forces were officially given North Vietnam. Bao Dai was officially given South Vietnam, and the French finally got out of the picture. They left Vietnam in 1956. For the record, Bao Dai did not agree with decisions made at the Geneva Convention, nor did the United States. And so the War of Independence that ended at Geneva proved to start a civil war between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. The war was ignited in 1957 when North Vietnam dared to cross the 17th parallel. The North Vietnamese would view the Civil War as a war of national liberation in hopes of uniting the North and the South and keeping them free from all outside influence. Some would label the conflict the Second Indochina War for starting on the heels of the First Indochina War. Americans would call it the Vietnam War and struggle to understand it. Within a year of the Geneva Convention, Bao Dai and his puppet regime were replaced in the South Vietnam. Through a rigged election, Ngo Dinh Diem became the president of the newly formed Republic of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh maintained possession of the North. U.S. leaders thought Diem was the perfect solution to South Vietnam's problems because Diem was staunchly anti-communist. This was the Cold War era, and so before the United States even entered the Vietnam War, it gave tremendous support to Diem. But behind the scenes, Ngo Dinh Diem and his family members were corrupt and misguided. Without the approval of the United States, Diem resorted to cruel methods of a dictator to purge South Vietnam of communists. Under Diem, 50 to 75,000 South Vietnamese may have been tortured or imprisoned. Thousands who suffered were Buddhists. A small group of South Vietnamese took the matter of Ngo Dinh Diem into their own hands and instigated the assassination of Diem on November 2nd, 1963. Coincidentally, the assassination took place just 20 days before John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Therefore, Lyndon B. Johnson, as Kennedy's successor, would carry the difficult burden of deciding whether or not the United States should officially enter the Vietnam War by getting more involved. By 1964, South Vietnam was in a state of shambles, at least politically speaking. Due to corruption and distrust, the leadership of the newly formed nation changed hands 6 to 7 times in 1 year, while North Vietnam was continuing to push at the South's borders. For the United States to abandon South Vietnam at that time would be to leave it extremely vulnerable to the communist North. Lyndon Johnson's advisors told him that if communism were allowed to take hold in South Vietnam, it would have a domino effect on the region and take several nations with it. Besides that, the United States had already pumped millions of dollars into Vietnam, moved in thousands of troops, and sprayed Agent Orange, which was a toxic herbicide, all across North Vietnam to kill off the foliage that helped hide guerrilla-style Viet Minh forces. Though harmful to people and animals, at least 11 million gallons of Agent Orange was used in Vietnam. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson made the controversial decision to proceed further with defending South Vietnam from Communist North. He didn't use Congress to declare war against North Vietnam. He resorted instead to proposing a retaliation that was based on a questionable conflict between U.S. warships and North Vietnamese PT boats. The incident in question occurred in the Gulf of Tonkin, and so the United States entered the Vietnam War in 1965 under what was called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Within 3 years of the war resolution, 500,000 U.S. troops were drafted and deployed. They were joined by troops from South Korea and Australia. A play-by-play of the Vietnam War after the United States entered is difficult. It's challenging because there were very few clear-cut battle lines or battlefields in the Vietnam War. The thick foliage and mountainous terrain of Vietnam would not allow for it. Victory and defeat were determined by body count rather than by territory gained or lost. And furthermore, communists lived in both North Vietnam and South Vietnam, making it difficult, if not impossible, for U.S. soldiers to identify the Viet Minh. Without a battlefront, the United States and its allies resorted to a search and destroy mentality to fight Viet Minh forces. In 1965, Johnson authorized the start of Operation Rolling Thunder by dropping bombs over North Vietnam. Though the bombing lasted 3 years, Rolling Thunder failed to slow down the forces of Ho Chi Minh. Using the tactics of guerrilla warfare, the Viet Minh would not stop invading the South in their efforts to unite it to the North. Ho Chi Minh said, "If they force us into war, we will fight. The struggle will be atrocious, but the Vietnamese people will suffer anything rather than renounce their freedom." Ho Chi Minh's words came true. Atrocious fighting seesawed between the North and the South for years. For example, at the close of 1965, the United States gained the Ia Drang Valley through vicious fighting, but was severely ambushed at Plai Me. In 1966, B-52 bombers entered the war, allowing South Vietnam to gain the cities of Hue and Da Nang. In 1967, bitter fighting took place at the Battle of Dak To, where the 173rd Airborne Brigade held on to Hill 875 against great odds. The U.S. soldiers would complain along the way that they were restrained from winning the war by Johnson's waffling policies. It appeared that Johnson held back support of South Vietnam for fear of igniting a bigger war against China and Russia, both of which continued to support North Vietnam. As a milestone in the Vietnam War, January 31st, 1968, saw the start of the Tet Offensive, a strategy of aggressive attacks by North Vietnam. It was named Tet for the celebration of the Lunar New Year, Tet Nguyen Dang. Unlike the guerrilla warfare usually employed by the North, the Tet Offensive was a highly organized assault against 800 towns and villages in South Vietnam, including the capital city of Saigon. The North masterminded the assault by transporting men and weapons along the legendary Ho Chi Minh Trail, a spidery network of roads and trails running north and south in the jungles of Vietnam along its western border. As well orchestrated as the Tet Offensive was, it was not entirely successful. The North did catch the South by surprise, but it cost the North about 40,000 lives. The United States dropped more bombs on Ho Chi Minh Trail than were ever dropped over Germany in World War II. By body count, the North lost. Adding to the loss of manpower, the North was eventually pushed out of the South, but in the end, the Tet Offensive demonstrated how bold the North could be, and so psychologically, it helped the North and hurt the South. It certainly led more Americans to question the role of the United States in Vietnam. Adding some confusion to the Tet Offensive, both the North and the South claimed to win the 77-day Battle of Khe Sanh, which was fought at the same time as the Tet attacks. In the Battle of Khe Sanh, the U.S. Marines and Viet Minh forces battled each other over an abandoned military base. Some military historians think the battle was merely a diversion by the North to lure thousands of Marines away from the towns they were defending in the South. Like many operations in the Vietnam War, the results of Khe Sanh and the Tet Offensive were muddled by politics and public opinion. One thing is for certain, though. 50 million Americans watched uncensored news footage of the Tet Offensive showing the horrors of war up close and personal. It's no wonder they protested. In March of 1968, U.S. soldiers would reflect the frustration of the Vietnam War in a shameful event called the My Lai Massacre. In this atrocity, 20-plus U.S. soldiers killed 300 to 500 unarmed men, women, and children. When word of the massacre reached the United States, it jolted supporters of the war and outraged the growing anti-war movement. Back in the United States, Richard Nixon ran for president in 1968 on the promise that he would bring troops home from Vietnam. He won the office of the presidency, but took his time withdrawing troops. Before getting out of Vietnam, Nixon employed the policy of Vietnamization. His aim was to strengthen South Vietnam before pulling the troops out. Search and destroy tactics diminished in exchange for rebuilding the society of South Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh died in 1969, never seeing his homeland united. The United States lingered several more years in Vietnam, bombing supply lines linked to Cambodia, attacking Hanoi and Haiphong, and seeing the death toll of Americans rise. At home, Kent State, a college in Ohio, saw a deadly response to a student anti-war demonstration in 1970. Nixon was reelected in 1972 under tremendous pressure from the American public, expressed in a loud and growing peace movement that included a wide range of people and groups. Nixon agreed to a ceasefire in 1973. Henry Kissinger, the U.S. Secretary of State, signed the agreement with communist diplomat Le Duc Tho. Both men were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973 for agreeing to end the war in Vietnam. But Le Duc refused to accept it. For him, peace did not exist in Vietnam. 2 years after the United States withdrew from Vietnam, the city of Saigon in the south fell to the communists of North Vietnam. On July 2, 1976, Vietnam was officially united as a single communist nation and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Saigon was promptly renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Vietnam paid a high price for its independence and unification, losing about 3 million of its people in the war. Another million South Vietnamese were imprisoned in cruelly run re-education camps, and approximately 2 million attempted to flee by boat. Thus, for some time, the Vietnamese refugees were nicknamed the Boat People. On behalf of South Vietnam, the United States lost 58,000 men, most of them younger than 22 years old. 3 million total served in the war. Additionally, at least 1,000 U.S. soldiers were deemed missing in action, and 150,000 were seriously wounded or maimed for life. Because of improved medical care, a higher ratio of U.S. soldiers survived the Vietnam War than had survived World War II, but their wounds were costly. Injured or not, most U.S. soldiers returned home to a nation that shunned them for their participation in Vietnam. According to Vietnam vets that were interviewed, many vets were asked not to be dressed in their military uniforms upon arriving back in America. It supposedly aroused too much anti-war sentiment. Sadly, Americans in general vented their political frustrations against the men and women who sacrificed and served. As for the Vietnamese, after 15 years of bloodshed to make Vietnam a communist nation, it is not strongly communist today. The system failed to make the people of Vietnam prosperous. Communism also failed to bring peace to Vietnam or to its neighbor Cambodia. As a matter of fact, communists from Vietnam went to war against revolutionaries from Cambodia who called themselves Khmer Rouge, or Red Cambodians. The Khmer Rouge was led by Pol Pot, a cruel dictator. Pol Pot, set on becoming the dictator of Cambodia, saw to the killing of approximately 2 million Cambodians through work, torture, and starvation in re-education camps. These camps were called killing fields for the large number of civilians who died in and around the fields surrounding them. In 1979, Vietnam successfully deposed Pol Pot during the height of the Cambodian-Vietnamese War. But Pol Pot remained a threat up to his death in 1998, which was not all that long ago. In retrospect, a communist advisor said in 1990, "Our belief in a communist utopia had nothing to do with reality. We tried to build a new society on theories and dreams. Instead of stimulating production by giving people incentives, we collectivized them. It was preposterous." A Vietnamese woman and prominent doctor stated years after the war, "I have been a communist all my life, but now I have seen the realities of communism, and it is a great failure. Mismanagement, corruption, privilege, repression. My ideals are gone." These statements are a sad aftermath to the tragic ordeal. As with many wars and conflicts, it would appear that millions died and suffered for a cause that wasn't lasting and an idea that fell short of the glory it promised.